Hello, my name is Andrew Keane. Welcome to Keane on America, the daily interview show about the United States. Hello, everybody. Very interesting piece in the Wall Street Journal a few days ago about how patients are using AI with or without the permission of their doctors. It comes from an interesting new poll put together by KFF, which suggests that 1 in 3 adults are actually using AI for health information. In other words, the machines are already seeing us, which is the title of a new book. The exact title is The Machines Will See You Now by my guest, Anmol Madan, a human roadmap to autonomous healthcare. Anmol is a AI healthcare entrepreneur living just up the road from me in San Francisco. Anmol, the book is out the beginning of September. Congratulations.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm excited.
Did you use, by the way, Anmol, before we get into AI and healthcare, did you use AI to write the book? My friend and I, Keith Tier, we have a weekly tech show. He lives in Palo Alto, seasoned entrepreneur, and he's boasting about using AI to write a book in about 20 minutes. Did you use Claude or OpenAI for this new book?
I did not, Andrew, and some of that is because the manuscript was written a couple of years ago now and went through a series of revisions and clinical reviews and peer reviews and things as part of the publishing process. So I don't know if I would use it more aggressively today. I think when I was writing this a couple of years ago, it was just, the AI tools were just starting to get there, and they were, I think it was certainly a great thinking and sort of collaborative thinking process, but the writing quality just wasn't there. And I also think if you're going to write a book, there's something about the authenticity of that kind of putting your own ideas and pen on paper, which I think is important if you're going to go write something. So I did not, but who knows? Maybe with the next step I do this, I might.
Maybe, you can write a follow-up. Do you think there's the same sniffiness within the medical community about AI as there is within the publishing business? Publishers are very wary of books authored by AI. In fact, some publishers don't want their authors to even use AI for grammatical or second readings, critical readings. There are, of course, a lot of doctors who are wary of AI, seeing it perhaps as looking over their shoulder, doing away with their jobs. Is there a similar kind of nervousness, antipathy within the medical community towards AI?
Yeah, and for context, I'm an AI PhD, not a medical doctor, so we'll have to just use that asterisk as a caveat as I comment. But I do think the dialogue is broken, Andrew, and I see it broken really in two ways. I think on one side, you've got just incredible exuberance and excitement. And, this is the AI community and computer scientists like myself. We're out there and saying like, oh, this is all works great, and we're going to automate healthcare, and da. That's one end. And on the other end, rightly so, a lot of the medical community has really good, thoughtful questions about safety, validity, testing, rigor. And I would, sort of my personal view on this, again, I can't speak for the entire community here, but my personal view here is just because we're using AI or we have a new kind of technology doesn't mean we drop how we think of medical devices or healthcare specific software applications and the guardrails and the safeguards that need to exist. So I think the right answer is actually somewhere in between. And I think part of my reason for writing this book is I felt I was getting frustrated with the broken dialogue. Is like on one side you had people who were just really excited about it to no degree and weren't thinking through what the important steps were, what the nuances were. And then on the other side, you had people who were just really anxious and sort of not clear where this would go, but also had to come to terms with what you just shared a minute ago, which is a meaningful number of consumers that are out there looking for this information. And if they're not looking for it on ChatGPT, they're probably looking for it on TikTok. And so consumer appetite and behaviors are there. and we kind of have to go in and meet them where we are. So I think that's yeah.
And from your point of view, as a AI entrepreneur, you're the CEO of Radiant Graph, an AI platform for large healthcare.
Yeah.
Do you celebrate, or are you nervous about this KKR report that suggests that 1 in 3 adults are already using AI for health information, with or without their doctors? Presumably, they're going to the machines before they go to the doctors or in place of their doctors. Does that suggest good news, if not from the point of view of Radiant Graph as a startup, but more in terms of how this new technology, which is a new way of thinking and doing, is changing the medical industry, the healthcare industry?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both, and I'll give you both sides of the argument. So I think it's exciting that people are finding value, and it's exciting. And like, let's start with the bigger question, right? I mean, healthcare in our society is fundamentally broken, and I talk about this in the book, where we have one of the highest spends in sort of in healthcare expenditure as a country. We don't have great outcomes.
And we, of course, is the United States of America.
The United States, yes. And we don't have the best outcomes as a country compared to other developed countries for what we spend. We have massive access shortages and everything from mental health to, we talk about things like Medicaid and Medicare. So I think overall healthcare, despite the amount of money we spend on it, and whether we spend on it as employers, we also spend money on it as taxpayers. Right. And even we're talking about San Francisco, and we're talking about the Bay Area, and the amount that we spend on programs and supporting our local populations as well. And so I think fundamentally we're not, when I look at the last couple of decades of innovation in healthcare, my kind of frustration, and I've been part of some amazing companies, is we haven't really seen the impact of that on the economics of healthcare, perhaps even the quality and access of healthcare. And and this is a big risk with this area. So what is exciting is that people are finding value, that they're going off, they're looking for help. I think if we create the right experience and the right safeguards, it is a mechanism to make healthcare more accessible, right? I'd like to live in a universe, in this parallel universe, where healthcare doesn't cost us $4.7 trillion. It maybe costs us half of that, and we have twice as much access. And we know that the AI systems that are delivering that access are safe and tested and rigorous. That's the parallel universe I'd like to live in. But there's a lot of steps between where we are, the reality of where we are, and that parallel universe, right? So it's promising in that, okay, great, people are finding value, they're looking at these things, but we've got to create the right support mechanism for society to transition to that. Some of that is technology. Some of that is helping the medical community and the healthcare community get comfortable with this change that's coming, right? The various elements of the workforce. But some of that is also how we structure healthcare, how we pay for healthcare, how we're incentivizing innovation in healthcare. So a lot of those things have to move together. So again, it's a long-winded answer to an easy question. I think it's exciting, but there's a lot of work to be done for the real vision to emerge here.
You said earlier, Anmol, that the American healthcare system is fundamentally broken. You're not the first or the last person to say that. You wrote an interesting piece recently on healthcare equity 2.0, bridging the equity gap with AI agents. Is the main reason why it's broken, or the main consequence of it being broken, that there's a great division between access for wealthy people and everybody else? Is that the biggest reason it's broken, or is it broken because of the insurance system, because of the unhappiness of doctors, because of the state of hospitals? How would you define this brokenness?
Yeah, you're asking me the trillion-dollar question, like what's the causality, what's the underlying cause? And it's probably some combination of all of those, right? I think, are there economic structures of how we pay for healthcare and how we incentivize certain behaviors that could evolve and would have a better impact? Yes, right. And so as an industry, we've spoken at length about value-based care. And so as a historical kind of background here, most of the care that we receive in the US is fee-for-service, which is a doctor sees a patient and gets paid for that, right? And with value-based care, there's an incentive to take on financial risk. But value-based care is still a small percentage of the total spend in care, total care that's delivered, right? So it's still an emerging bucket, and there are different areas where you're seeing more of it, some parts of Medicare and in other pockets of it. So I think there's some structural issues. I think the thing that I would sort of have the humility to say is, I'm not with the book or as a computer scientist building these systems in the real world. I'm not going to solve the broader regulation, economic incentive problems. I mean, there's a lot of debate on both sides of the political aisle. There's lots of kind of arguments for how healthcare payments would work and what the incentives are. So I think there are some structural issues that are, I'd say, outside the purview, and then sort of cheating and sort of sidestepping those issues, right? But the thing that we do control, the thing that is in the hands of people building these systems and building these technologies, as well as, I would say, pioneering medical experts who are participating in helping and shaping these technologies. The thing that we do absolutely control, that we don't have any excuse for, is thinking through the broader roadmap of what these technologies can do well. What are the ways in which you think about clinical safety and guardrails? And then how do we find the right relationship with regulators, whether it's folks at the state medical boards, the FDA, and other places, to create safe environments or boxes for these systems to start to help take on the access burden in our society, right? And so I think there's this question of, if people aren't getting access to care, and if we can have AI systems come in and start helping with, screening information, helping them connect to first order support, if we can create opportunities for them to get coaching on things like behavioral health or managing their diabetes, in the absence of human resources that are missing in today's healthcare economy, I mean, are those things that, how do we design for those? How do we make sure they're safe? How do we make sure we kind of bring those to market? I think that's the part that we do control as technologists. And there's enough market incentive and there's enough need in society to go solve these things for us to go build those systems, right? There's the equity argument that you pulled up there for a second, going back to health equity, my thesis on that is, health equity is sort of, it used to be a really promising word, and I'd say in the last couple of years, it's kind of taken a different, less popular kind of viewpoint. Some of that depends on the administration that's in charge and their viewpoint. It sort of percolates to the system. But if you think about the fundamental level, right, one of the big issues in healthcare is, there's a lot of personal context in how healthcare works, right? So let's say you and I, maybe we speak different languages, maybe we have different cultural viewpoints, maybe we live in different parts of San Francisco, right? And with human providers, even with the best intent and the best training, you're kind of always sort of dependent on the human to adapt and evolve to interact. With AI systems, you unlock kind of massive new opportunities for these systems to communicate with each one of us in a way that's personalized to us, right? So that's what's really magical and powerful, right? So I'll give you an example, right? There's a lot of literature about things like eating disorders, and eating disorders, people have one view of what that is, but there's a whole bunch of other subtypes, right? Different communities, right, have different forms of, and so like the system's adapting and saying, here's I'm going to speak to a person who's South Asian, kind of like me, and translate how I'm going to help them overcome the lifestyle changes they need to make or the behavioral changes they need to make, right? That stuff you can do with AI because you can adapt the tone, you can adapt the empathy, you can adapt the language, you can bring in a lot of information about the person, which was very hard to do with human providers. So there's things that we can do here which actually make healthcare more personalized, more effective in some ways, and then defining the right safeguards. I think that's part of the vision that I lay out in the book.
But isn't that what a doctor should do? I mean, it's no secret that, for example, you're of Indian heritage from your name or your looks. Yeah. You go and see your doctor, they would pick up on that, or they would have that information in your file. Yeah. How are doctors dealing with this? How should they deal with this? We've done many shows on this subject, Anmol. One of my most frequent guests is Robert Pearl, who used to run a major insurance network here, Kaiser, teaches now at Stanford. I'm sure you've come across him. He wrote a book, a best-selling book, about how miserable doctors are. How will AI help doctors do a better job, a more effective job, and maybe not be quite as overworked, feeling exploited, and unhappy.
Yeah. So, and Andrew, there's a lot of nuance here, right? And so I will, one of the things I talk about in the book is actually a roadmap for increasing autonomy in healthcare.
Yeah, and the subtitle of the book is a human roadmap to autonomous healthcare, and maybe we'll define what autonomous healthcare means too.
And so I kind of talk about, and I use self-driving cars, and self-driving cars were, there was this issue of maybe a decade ago with self-driving cars, which somebody had sort of drivers and somebody was using lidars, all these manufacturers, and you didn't know what was what, right? And then the industry came up with standards that kind of laid out the different levels of automation in that industry. And it went all the way from kind of cruise control and little help with the driver, all the way to fully automated cars, right? It kind of laid out where you were playing, and different companies then chose a different path to play in there, right? A lot of the traditional manufacturers focused on supporting the driver, and then other companies like Waymo decided they were going to go all the way to the fully automated version, right? But it brought structure and it brought clarity to how these different levels are defined, how they ought to be tested, potentially how they ought to be regulated by local governments and cities. So I think that's one of the things I lay out. And I do kind of an equivalent version for the increasing levels of potential autonomy in healthcare. And so most of healthcare that I kind of call out in society today is kind of like a level 0, right? It's like the base level where 99% of the decisions are human made. There's a nurse or a doctor that's making a treatment decision, a diagnosis decision. They're prescribing a medication or perhaps a clinical treatment. And I sort of talk about how we could think of multiple levels of that to be supported by machines, or perhaps even augmented, operated by machines. And so the next immediate level, which we're sort of getting to, is machines reading. I kind of call this like doctor assistance, right? So kind of level 1, which is machines kind of coming in and reading X-rays and reading radiology reports and reading imaging and arming you with the right information as a human provider, as a human doctor or nurse, to kind of use that information and make better decisions, right? Or make the actual decisions. And that's taking away some of the cognitive burden that exists in the work of a doctor. And I think we're seeing a lot of that being deployed in society today. And especially when you look at fields like radiology, they've come a long way where, I've had doctors describe this to me as, I'd have to carry like backpacks of reports to read. And now the system's kind of like telling them where to focus. And so they're spending their time understanding and reviewing the data that's analyzed by machines versus not. So that's kind of like level 1. That's kind of like the cruise control.
Yeah, I mean, using the Waymo example, though, Amnol, that I know you use, you and I, if we were to visit one another, you're a mile or 2 away in San Francisco, we'd catch a Waymo, automated car. The drivers have been taken out of the equation. So why would doctors be encouraged with that? I mean, I take your point that maybe doctors will do the face-to-face with patients, but I'm assuming that the algorithm also can be taught to do that in a more sophisticated way, in a way that won't be affected by moods. Why should doctors be happy about machines seeing all of us?
Yeah, and so that's where I start to tease into the level 2 and the level 3, where there's increasing levels of automation, right? Where the machines are now taking on perhaps the lowest level of treatment and diagnosis decisions, and they may still go through a human review, right? So I think from a technical perspective, there is a way for us to de-risk this problem, and there's also a way for us to structure the right validation and sort of regulatory perspective to oversee that. To go back to your point of like, why do human doctors care? Why should a healthcare provider care, right? Maybe even a nurse, right? Beyond doctors, maybe this also impacts how nurses work, impacts how other professionals work in a healthcare setting. I kind of go back to, and I'm not a doctor, so it's sort of not my place to say this, but I'll sort of draw this comparison anyways, which is, I think just because, you think of like how we traveled, you look at other industries have gone through this transition, right? I'll use crossing oceans, for example, right? Just because, you have a pilot who's in control, where autopilot's doing 70, 80, 90% of the flying on a transatlantic flight, doesn't mean, right, that person's sort of no longer important, right? So it's sort of like, you don't have to be pulling the sails. You don't have to be pulling the rudder to cross the ocean, right? You've seen this in other.
So I take your point, and of course you're right. We still have pilots sitting on, especially transatlantic jets, even if they don't spend all the time driving, so to speak, the plane. What do you think humans can do that machines will never be able to do? I mean, you talk about this human roadmap to autonomous healthcare, which to some might sound like a contradiction. Of course, it's meant to sound like a contradiction, which it isn't necessarily. But what will the machines never be able to do when it comes to healthcare?
Yeah, so I think
and never, of course, is a
yeah.
is a dramatic word. I mean, who knows? But let's say in the next 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the machines today are kind of like toddlers walking around, learning how to walk, right? So they stumble, they're not very good, they make mistakes, right? So I think the risk that machines take over everything that human providers do or healthcare professionals do, I think is actually quite low. And I talk about it as like, that's kind of the end state. And by the way, we may never get to the end state, right? However, the framing I would kind of encourage doctors to have or healthcare professionals to have, including folks who work with us at Radiantcraft, our chief medical officer, our medical directors, our clinical experts, our coaching staff, right, who are associated with the company, who are guiding and overseeing the training of these systems, is think of it as like, where could we put these systems in a way that they can actually be trusted? And so really, I would think of these systems today, Andrew, as sort of little toddlers that are learning how to walk, and they're not very good, and they stumble, and they're going to make some mistakes. You're going to have layers of protection and safety to make sure that whatever you're trusting them, but having them do that frees up time and frees up resources and frees up capacity in a constrained healthcare system, which allows our healthcare providers who work incredibly hard to have better quality of life. So I think for us, I think the mistake would be, kind of falling in the trap of like, these systems are not perfect, so we shouldn't try them at all.
But that wasn't my question. I'm not sure you're really answering my question. I said to you, what can't humans, or what will machines never be able to do that humans can do? And you told me that currently these machines are like toddlers, which I don't think is particularly controversial. They're going to, as using that metaphor, they're going to grow up. They're going to become children, teenagers, middle-aged, old. What will they never be able to do?
I'll tell you where they seem to struggle. And so the issue with the never is that 30-year axis. As a computer scientist, you kind of learn never to predict 30-year predictions, but I'll do it anyways. So I'll tell you what seems easy for them to do and what seems hard for them to do that they may never learn to do as well as humans do. What seems easy for them is to solve especially with large language models and different classes of machine learning models prior to that, is for them to solve kind of the puzzle of taking a set of inputs and guessing the likely diagnosis or treatment actions, right? So the mathematical formulation, the kind of ability of these machines to navigate that is exceptionally good. Now, there's a little bit of an asterisk on the exceptionally good, because I think we actually aren't testing, one of the things I talk about, we aren't testing these systems the right way. I think we're applying human benchmarks to how we measure their accuracy. And I think these machines are going to fail differently than humans do. And so I think there's a conversation, are we testing the right things? But I think regardless of that asterisk, I think generally you can say they're very good and they'll only get better, because we are just starting to kind of scratch the surface of how fast we can innovate. The one area that I do call out as a place where we're underestimating, or we're sort of overestimating machines' capabilities and underestimating how hard it is this idea of human perception. Right. So when you and I are communicating, even though we're on video, my body language, the way I'm interacting, if I walk in and you're doing an in-person visit with me in a clinic, the way you assess me, I think those things are actually really still quite hard for machines. There are fields of computer science, so things like machine vision, a variety of kind of sensing, pervasive sensing techniques that are improving, but they're not improving at the same rate as sort of human providers are. So when you think of kind of like classic telemedicine use cases, outpatient use cases, right? So I'm not talking about robotic surgery and some of those kind of examples, but I'm talking about the kind of general everyday care, access to kind of basic everyday care, chronic condition care, primary care in our society, mental health care in our society. I think these machines are getting good at the problem solving part. They're still not that great at the assessment of the situation, and they may never get to human capacity. I think that's one area that may never happen, right? The other one that is still very early is it's clear that humans are forming relationships with these, LLMs, agents, companions, right? And so like we're seeing that obviously outside of healthcare tremendously, and people have these, especially when with the loneliness epidemic, people forming these relationships. But I don't think there's a ton of literature that shows that those relationships make people better in things like mental health, right? So I think that literature is still super early, where you having a relationship with a chatbot that you like or trust or whatever, is that actually clinically the same as the person working with a therapist, right? A human therapist that might spend the same 30 minutes. So I think just because you're having an interaction, does that interaction translate into better outcomes and things like mental health is also kind of early. So I would say those are things where, there are places where the technology curve is going like this. And if you project forward 12 months, 24 months, 5 years, you're like, yeah, we're going to nail it. Like diagnostic, treatment, kind of decision making, decision tree solving feels like one of those. And then there are places like the sensing element, the interaction element, where the curve is a lot more kind of early, right? And or the ability of people to form relationships with these AI therapists or coaches as they emerge and actually see better outcomes. That's also pretty early. So those are things there. If I had to guess what couldn't happen in 20 years, we may discover that those things actually never get as good as you want them to be. And you always have.
Yeah, and we've done some shows recently on the failure of therapy, or perhaps an over medicalized society full of anxious people who believe that they're suffering some sort of mental illness when in fact they're not, and spend too much time with therapists. So maybe a crisis of human therapists in the face of AI isn't such a bad thing. What should we be most fearful of? The Wall Street Journal wrote a piece recently on privacy, a piece about uploading blood work to AI and oversharing. Should we be concerned that these AI platforms, like perhaps Radiant Graph, aren't very secure, and that all our most intimate information is going to get known by the government, by our employees, by our friends?
Yeah, so I think, and I'll sort of talk about this in the general sense. I'm also happy to talk about Radiant Graph specifically if you want. But I think generally folks have to be mindful and thoughtful about how we're thinking about data, and not just, by the way, healthcare data. I think all data in this era of AI, right? And I think you started with the opening comment was around kind of like how the publishing community is thinking about AI and AI generated content. I do think one of the things that kind of spooked people early on was all the data, all the books and the articles on the internet kind of being processed by AI systems, and that knowledge going inside AI systems. So I think the same thing is going to happen for healthcare data as well, right? So, and I think it's kind of like a tricky problem, because on one end, in a purely kind of benevolent universe, right? If you imagine again, like a purely kind of optimistic, benevolent sort of scenario, the more data these systems have, the better they're going to get at learning things about us and also driving scientific discoveries, right? We may discover completely new understandings of what it is to be a person living with a chronic condition or dealing with mental health. We may understand completely different phenotypes of, say, depression and anxiety, if we were able to get all this data into some systems, right? So that's a benevolent kind of universe view. The reality on the other side, though, is sort of often there's individual incentives, there's security issues, there's like, data that you kind of have to make sure, is this a HIPAA compliant platform? Is this a PII compliant platform, right? So I think if you're going to work, and I believe healthcare needs its kind of own AI companies and own AI platforms, because you have to comply with all the things that matter when you're dealing with sensitive healthcare data, whether it's biometric data like you just shared, or lab data, or individual PHI. And so I think I don't know if the mass market LLMs like throwing this in a chat GPT or something like that is kind of the right frame right now. Now that is changing, because everybody from OpenAI to a lot of the smaller players have all created their version of the the healthcare specific one that maybe has a higher set of safeguards. But I think I would urge the average consumer personally, I mean, at least for me, being a little bit cautious of where we're sending our data and how we think of it, because I think we're still kind of defining a lot of this in the industry. And I think if it's a healthcare specific platform, like the one that we work on at Radiant Graph, right, it's important that you are secure, you're designed for PHI, you're very clear on how the data is used or required for healthcare operations, right? So there's certain guidelines that have to apply if you're going to be using this data in any kind of AI platform.
Why, you mentioned OpenAI, Sam Altman is another of our San Francisco neighbors, is not very trusted by most people. Slippery Sam, the same is true of Anthropic and many of these other AI startups. People just don't trust them. These people are in the business of making money. Why should we trust entrepreneurs in AI, healthcare, Amnol, like yourself? Why would we trust a company like Radiant Graph? And I don't want to turn this into a conversation about Radiant Graph any more than any other the platforms that are making entrepreneurs like you incredibly wealthy overnight, and in fact driving up the price of real estate in San Francisco.
Yeah. So we're a tiny startup. So just for context, we're not OpenAI and Anthropic. So thank you for putting us in the same category. But we have some work to do before we get there. But I think, maybe I do see where you're coming from, right? I do see this kind of like, hey, these people are starting these companies, and do they have the right incentives, and how are they benefiting from our data? And I think those are genuine concerns, and those are things that we have to think through. I tend to have a bit of the other perspective, which is, I kind of started a company straight out of grad school. So for me, it's like entrepreneurship or building these companies, whether it's in healthcare or in other domains. Part of what brings me to San Francisco, what I love about kind of being here is to me, that's kind of part of creating the future, right? That's the world that we want to live in. And so, yes, you're right.
Although I'm not sure people want to live. I mean, if San Francisco is indeed the future, when you walk around this city, which on the one hand has, multi-million-dollar mansions everywhere, on the other hand, armies of homeless people on the street. I'm not sure anyone really wants this as a future.
Fair. I think there is a massive amount of social inequity in San Francisco, and I would agree with that as a resident of the city. And I think, by the way, we have a lot of work to do in public health in San Francisco as well. And so, for anybody who's listening, I'm a advisor to the Department of Public Health in New York City. I would love to do some work here and just kind of help out where I can. And I know there are lots of entrepreneurs like myself who want to do that. So I think so agree with you on that. But I think what's interesting about the Bay Area is if you look at the technologies that have changed our world in the last 30 years, right? Starting from like the personal computer to the iPhone to what we saw with the web, right, in 2000 to what we're seeing today with AI, what we saw in like 2011, 2012. And so you look at all these companies. As a person who went to school in Boston, right, and sort of enjoyed his time in Boston, right? You look at San Francisco and you're like, this is where...
Almost Boston, Amnol. You were at MIT, just over the river in Cambridge.
That's right, yeah. And so...
You're going to offend all the Cambridge people.
Sorry, as I call it, the People's Republic of Cambridge, as I was there, right? So it's like that's what's special about this place, right? And so you're right. There's bad sides to everything. There are things we should be doing better. We have social issues to work on for sure. I think there's probably a lot of comments. We probably have a whole podcast episode on like San Francisco local politics and how we are operating and things.
Well, we've done many of those, yes, of course.
Right, and like there's a lot of work for us to do in the city. I do not think, and I say this to everybody from San Francisco listening, I think we will, while we have a great tech community and we have a great, kind of social kind of scene here, I think we have a lot of work to do as a city, and I think all of us need to like help out in one of our cities and do that. So with that said, but what's interesting about the Bay Area is these people have pioneered, kind of different stages of our society, right? Just this morning, I don't know if you caught it, as we're recording, but Jeff Dean just announced he's starting something new, and Jeff Dean is
at Google, one of the first 20 people at Google now is
like and for those of us who grew up in computer science, right, in the last decade, if you look at the innovations that have come out of that small group, the stuff that he himself has touched, or that Google has created in that era, and I think that's, a lot of what society is today, a lot of what the world is today, right? You travel to Asia, you travel to Europe, a lot of what the world takes for granted actually kind of happened here. And I think again, I'm not saying everything's fixed. I think we have a lot of work to do. I think we have a lot of stuff that's broken in San Francisco, in California, both in the US healthcare system. But the thing we do have is incredibly smart, talented people who are, a lot of startups today are 996 or whatever version we call, who are pushing with some vision, because at least some part of them wants to live in a better society, like wants to invent the thing that's going to make life better for us. And so I go back to your point, like what, I can't talk about the other companies or whatever, but I think for me, what drives me and what I'd like to exist in this universe is a place where we have, twice as much access in healthcare. Our providers have a much better quality of life. Our nurses and doctors are not doing the little mechanical tasks. We're kind of automating a lot of kind of, simpler care use cases, situations with the right guardrails, with the right supervisions. And healthcare in our society is preventative, right? Versus waiting for people when they are, and costs half as much. And if we can take the next decade or two and take advantage of the shift and get there, that's totally worth it, right? That's what we should be marching towards.
And one of the things that, and I've had this conversation with Robert Pearl as well on this, is you don't need to be a nuclear scientist. You don't have to have an MIT degree, Amnol, or a Stanford degree to understand that you should eat healthy food, that you shouldn't go to fast food too much, you shouldn't drink too much alcohol, you should exercise. So a lot of the preventative stuff that Robert Pearl or you talk about is out there in the culture. Maybe people don't want to hear about it. Maybe they're switching off when they hear it. But why would a machine that tells someone that they need to lose a bit of weight, or they need to stop smoking, or they need to reduce their alcohol or drug intake, why is that going to convince them any more than what a doctor will tell them or what they see on television, the radio, or on the internet?
Yeah, that's a great point. So, and I think you hit the nail right on the head, right? Is if we could just solve the behavior change problem in healthcare, that's $1 trillion out of the 4.7, right? There's different people who've kind of come up with that statistic. And so that's kind of the way to think of it is massive, massive issue. So let's take a specific example, Andrew, and I'll tell you where I think machines can work, right? So a person goes to the doctor's office, maybe they show up for, an exam, meeting their doctor once a month, once every few months, once a quarter, right? They get to that advice and then they kind of forget and then they go off, right? Where I think these systems can play a role, and I've seen them play a role in my previous companies and in sort of, in real world settings, is they then pick up the part that's kind of in between the doctor's visits, right? So an example, and they cater that and they personalize that to your needs. So let's take a person who's living with, say, type 2 diabetes, right? And let's say they're managing their diabetes, but they're at risk of getting unmanaged. Maybe they track their blood glucose, maybe they don't. They're not kind of, they go to the doctor's office like 3 days after the visit, they're like super engaged, and then they kind of like fall off, right? All of us do that, right? All of us are probably guilty of that, right? And so what these systems can do is then they can learn what's the right way to support and engage this person, right? What's the right way to engage this person? And so let's say this person is less likely to change their diet. Maybe they're more likely to walk more. Maybe there's a comorbidity with mental health. They're stressed out. They're stressy, right? Maybe there's certain kinds of coaching and support that they need. So instead of kind of like the generic one size fits all, eat healthy, walk more, like the system actually personalizes every element of your experience to make it easier for you to eliminate that friction, eliminate that barrier that's getting in the way, right? And so I've seen this at scale, in commercial scale, and in some of the previous companies, we built these systems to help tens of millions of people kind of understand their patterns and learn those, right? And so when I think of machines starting to help with the actual care delivery, the way we experience healthcare, I think there's an opportunity for that kind of personalization to exist, right? And so if you think of a coach, for example, helping you manage your diabetes, your experience could be completely different from mine because the stuff that you would respond to might be completely different from what I respond to, right? And just in that specific context of managing type 2, we may have the same A1C, we may have the same age group and the same demographic variables, but we are different individuals, and what will engage us in our care is fundamentally different. And so I think that's where these things can shine. And because they're machines, we don't have to carve out human time. We don't have to carve out a person to go think about those, process that information, come up to the call, be prepared. It kind of happens programmatically and can happen at massive, massive scale for essentially.
Well, yeah, and I take your point. I hope you're right, although I have a feeling that with AI slop being increasingly ubiquitous, messages from the machine on getting more exercise might be seen as complete slop and be eliminated. Anyway, you may be right. Maybe the machines will see you now in terms of medicine, healthcare. Maybe that's a good thing. We are in the brink, for better or worse, probably, of a human roadmap to autonomous healthcare. Certainly the autonomous healthcare stuff's for real. Whether there's a human roadmap is another issue. Finally, Amnol, I often do this when we have AI conversations, especially with entrepreneurs, because bots are becoming more and more ubiquitous. The machines will see you now suggests that doctors maybe will become scarcer and scarcer or less and less seen. How would you convince me and our audience that you aren't a bot? What's human about you?
Well, I'm quite flawed and I'm often wrong. And so, but part of being a technologist and part of being an entrepreneur and someone who's starting companies, you kind of have to take the big swings. I feel like, you can spend 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day at work, and you might as well take the biggest swing you can and sort of create the world that you want to exist. So in terms of, if I was a machine or an AI avatar of Anmol, I probably wouldn't be as wrong as I sometimes am. So, we're all like here, we're kind of like learning machines, and we figure out, we try new ideas, we see how they work, and we get better. So that's kind of how I think of
and that's a priceless response, which is not surprising given that Amnol in Sanskrit means priceless. Amnol Madan, a San Francisco-based entrepreneur and the author of a new book, The Machines Will See You Now, A Human Roadmap to Autonomous Healthcare. Congratulations, Amnol, on the book, and best of luck, and congratulations as well with your AI platform for large healthcare. Radiant Graph might not be quite OpenAI or Anthropic yet, but you still can grow. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hi, this is Andrew again. Thank you so much for listening or watching the show. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe. We're on Substack, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, all the platforms. And I'd be very curious as to your comments as well on what you think of the show, how it can be improved, and the kinds of guests that you would enjoy hearing or listening to in future. Thank you again.